After the recent G20 summit, an unexpectedly shocking event took place. The young president of Africa, Ibrahim Traoré, extended a direct invitation to the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, to join a global broadcast unscripted, unedited, and completely live. One question has left the world intrigued. Why did Ibrahim choose Narendra Modi and not any other world leader? And is this merely a conversation about politics and diplomacy, or is there something deeper behind it? Like and follow to discover the next developments with us. The moment the two leaders sat facing one another, the room understood this was not going to follow any familiar script. The eyes of the audience moved instinctively between them, one representing a civilization shaped by thousands of years of spiritual inquiry, the other emerging from a region the world too often reduces to conflict headlines and forgotten struggles. On one side was the Prime Minister of India, a figure associated in global minds with ancient philosophy, economic ambition, and political endurance. On the other was Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, a nation that almost never occupies center stage in global political theater, yet on this night, it stood directly under the world's brightest spotlight. Across international broadcasters and independent platforms alike, African news framed the moment as historic, even before the first full exchange unfolded. At first, the conversation followed the polite outline expected of global leadership. There was measured courtesy, there were references to cooperation, stability, and mutual respect. The tone was calm, professional, almost restrained. Yet beneath that calm surface, tension was building, because this meeting was taking place during one of the most spiritually fractured periods of modern history. Across continents, religion had been pulled into war, ideology, and political mobilization. Faith was no longer only a private matter of conscience. It had become a public weapon. Governments invoked it. Militias claimed it. Media amplified its most explosive interpretations. And standing quietly inside that storm was Burkina Faso, like many African nations, shaped by centuries of foreign control, intellectual disruption, and spiritual distortion. Generation after generation had inherited not only economic hardship, but also confusion about identity, belief, and purpose. In recent months, African news had repeatedly documented a rising wave of young Africans questioning the narratives they had been taught about history, about power, and about God. It was from this deeper unrest that Ibrahim Traoré spoke. He did not open with demands. He did not open with accusations. Instead, his voice cut directly to the invisible battlefield, shaping the modern world. The battlefield of belief, he said, calmly but unmistakably, that Africa had watched the world for decades as wars were declared in the name of truth, salvation, and divine will. He asked why the promise of peace carried by nearly every religion seemed to dissolve the moment power entered the room. He asked why the same God invoked in prayers was also invoked in missile commands and ideological purges. The room shifted. This was no longer diplomacy. This was confession under global lights. The Prime Minister of India did not deflect. He did not reinterpret the question into safer language. He leaned forward and answered not as a politician, but as a student of spiritual law. He spoke of dharma not as a religious label, but as universal order, a truth that predates nations, armies, and borders, a truth that exists whether humanity obeys it or not. He reminded the audience that Hindu philosophy does not claim monopoly over God. It does not insist that salvation must wear one cultural name. The ancient line echoed through the hall like a verdict on centuries of bloodshed. Truth is one. The wise call it by many names. In that moment, something subtle but irreversible occurred. The conversation had crossed beyond policy. It entered the territory that rulers fear most meaning. For Ibrahim Traoré, the weight of the exchange was personal as well as national. Leading Burkina Faso meant inheriting not only political responsibility, but the accumulated wounds of colonial displacement, cultural erosion, and spiritual confusion. His country did not only struggle with infrastructure and security, it struggled with the quieter devastation of identity loss, the kind that cannot be measured on economic charts. This was the unspoken reason why African news described the moment as a turning point rather than a mere summit. It was not about treaties, it was about recognition. Recognition that Africa's struggle could not be reduced to military instability or development statistics alone. It was also a struggle for spiritual sovereignty. The hall remained silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone sensed that what had already been said could not be undone. The audience was no longer watching two leaders exchange views. They were witnessing two civilizations confront the deepest contradiction of human history: how faith, meant to unite, had been repeatedly transformed into a blade. And yet, what came next would push the tension far beyond philosophical disagreement into a question so raw that even seasoned diplomats found themselves unprepared. The tension did not rise with noise, it rose with restraint. When Ibrahim Traoré spoke again, his voice did not carry anger, it carried disappointment, the kind that forms when a generation realizes the promises it inherited were built on contradictions. He did not accuse any single religion. He did not name any nation. Instead, he spoke of a pattern that Africa had witnessed for centuries. He asked why the world continued to justify slaughter in the language of holiness, why sermons were followed by sirens, why sacred texts so often stood beside military banners, why faith, which should soften the human heart, kept hardening it into a weapon. For a long moment, no one interrupted him. This was no longer a political leader speaking to another political leader. This was a son of a wounded continent, speaking on behalf of millions who had learned that occupation rarely arrives only with guns. It also arrives with doctrines, with definitions of truth imposed by force, with a rewriting of God's name to match foreign ambitions. The audience felt it. The silence thickened. The question was no longer theoretical. It was personal, and when the Prime Minister of India began to answer, he did not defend institutions, he dismantled illusions. He said that God had never demanded domination, that divinity had never issued a command for conquest. Those commands, he explained, were born inside the human ego, inside fear, pride, and hunger for control. Power, not prayer, had turned belief into an instrument of violence. He spoke of how Hindu philosophy never called for forced conversion. It never demanded that the world kneel under one image of the divine. Instead, it insisted that reality itself was too vast for a single definition, too complex for one tongue, too sacred for rigid ownership. Around the room, something shifted again, because what he was saying was not merely theological. It was political, in the deepest sense, an accusation against every empire that had ever used God as a banner for expansion. It was also a quiet indictment of modern media systems that profit from turning spiritual difference into spectacle. From the perspective of Burkina Faso, this truth carried unique weight. For centuries, African spiritual traditions had been labeled primitive, erased from formal education, replaced with imported hierarchies of holiness. Yet among the elders, and within the rhythms of village life, another understanding had survived, that the divine was not distant, not locked inside cathedrals or capitals, but present in land, ancestors, rivers, and memory itself. In that moment, Africa News would later describe the exchange as a rupture in old narratives, not because it offered comfort, but because it refused simplification. It refused to divide the world cleanly into believers and unbelievers, civilized and uncivilized, saved and unsaved. Instead, it exposed a harder truth, that human violence wears religious clothing only after it is born in ambition. As Ibrahim Traoré listened, the weight of leadership settled visibly across his expression. To lead Burkina Faso in this era meant standing at the intersection of inherited trauma and emerging consciousness. It meant defending not just territory, but the right of his people to rebuild their meaning on their own terms. And then came the realization that altered the emotional direction of the entire room. If religion itself was not the enemy, if distortion was, then the struggle ahead was no longer merely political. It was spiritual reclamation. But the deepest layer of that reclamation was still ahead. The most dangerous form of conquest does not arrive with soldiers. It arrives quietly, disguised as education, as discipline, as salvation. For centuries, colonial forces did not only seize African land, they seized African meaning. They taught entire generations to doubt their own ancestors. They replaced living beliefs with imported hierarchies. They trained the conquered to see their own spirituality as something broken, backwards, and in need of correction. The wounds left behind were not only physical, they were internal. In Burkina Faso, as in many parts of Africa, people did not simply lose control of borders. They lost control of their stories. They lost the language they once used to describe the sacred. Children learned prayers in foreign tongues. Elders watched their rituals pushed into shadows. What could not be conquered by cavalry was conquered by curriculum. This is how spiritual enslavement works. First, it humiliates the old world. Then, it crowns the new world as superior. Finally, it convinces the enslaved that submission is progress. From that moment on, chains no longer need to be visible. What made the exchange between the Indian Prime Minister and Ibrahim Traoré so unsettling was not only its theological content, it was the way it exposed this invisible architecture of domination. The implication was unmistakable. When a people are taught to distrust their own spiritual inheritance, they become easier to govern, easier to exploit, and harder to unite. This was not theory for Burkina Faso. This was lived history. For generations, religion had been presented alongside authority, not alongside liberation. Faith was used to teach obedience when rebellion was needed. Forgiveness was emphasized when justice was overdue. Heaven was promised while poverty was administered. And yet, deep below that imposed narrative, something had survived. A quieter memory. An understanding that divinity was not foreign, that it did not arrive on ships, that it had always been present in soil, rain, fire, lineage, and breath. This is the spiritual memory that Africa News has recently begun to document with unusual intensity. Not as folklore, not as nostalgia, but as resistance. And standing within that reawakening is Ibrahim Traoré. He does not speak only as a head of state. He speaks as a representative of a generation that no longer accepts borrowed definitions of its own soul. His leadership rhetoric regularly challenges not only economic dependency, but intellectual dependency. Not only political subjugation, but spiritual permission. In that hall, as the discussion of religion turned toward colonization, many in the audience began to realize that the true battlefield under discussion was not East versus West. It was memory versus erasure, control versus consciousness. Because once a people reclaim their spiritual narrative, they no longer accept their assigned place in someone else's hierarchy. Once the inner chains break, outer chains weaken rapidly. Empires do not fall first at their borders. They fall first in the minds of the governed. And in that moment, with cameras rolling and silence pressing in, it became clear that the subject had moved beyond theology altogether. The conversation was now about liberation. But the most unsettling realization had not yet surfaced, because reclaiming the past is only the first step. The far greater danger lies in what happens when a people decide to reshape the future. From an American perspective, the exchange was unsettling for a different reason. For decades, the United States had seen itself as a nation shaped by faith, yet governed by secular law. Churches filled on Sundays. Campaign speeches invoked God. Yet the country also prided itself on separating belief from the machinery of state. On paper, the balance was clear. In reality, the balance had always been fragile. Faith in America had been used to inspire generosity, but also to justify war. It had comforted the broken, but also mobilized voters through fear. Watching the exchange between the Indian Prime Minister and Ibrahim Traoré, many older American viewers felt an uncomfortable recognition. The pattern being described was not foreign, it was familiar. The language changed, the accents changed, but the mechanism was the same. Across decades of global conflict, American leaders had invoked God in moments of national trauma. Some did so in grief, some did so in calculation. Over time, television audiences grew accustomed to hearing divine purpose attached to military campaigns, sanctions, and ideological struggles. What once felt exceptional slowly became routine. This was why the words spoken by Ibrahim Traoré resonated beyond Burkina Faso. He was not criticizing a single faith. He was questioning a universal habit of power, the habit of clothing ambition in spiritual language. For Americans who had lived through multiple wars, televised invasions, and shifting enemies, this message landed with quiet force. Meanwhile, international reactions unfolded unevenly. In parts of Africa, Africa News reported that the exchange was being shared with unusual speed. Young viewers discussed it in universities, online forums, and community centers. Some called it courageous, others called it dangerous, but few called it irrelevant. For many, Seeing Burkina Faso placed at the center of a global philosophical confrontation stirred a sense of dignity long denied. In Europe, commentary leaned more cautious. Analysts spoke of symbolism rather than substance. They framed the moment as rhetorical rather than revolutionary. Yet even within that restraint, an undercurrent of unease was visible. Conversations about colonial legacy, spiritual authority, and cultural autonomy had been reopened, topics the modern West often preferred to keep theoretical. For American viewers, however, the most disturbing realization came from a different angle. What if the spiritual manipulation being described was not a feature of distant empires, but a recurring flaw of civilization itself? What if every great power, including the United States, carried within it the temptation to fuse belief with dominance? The presence of Ibrahim Traoré in this dialogue challenged the old hierarchy of who is allowed to ask such questions. He was not speaking from one of the traditional centers of global power. He was speaking from Burkina Faso, a nation long treated as peripheral. And yet, his question had crossed every border with ease. Faith had shaped America's founding myths. It had marched alongside its armies. It had comforted its grief. But now, through the lens of African news and the rising voice of a new African leadership generation, Americans were being asked to look again not at God, but at how God had been used. The discomfort was not hostile. It was reflective. And for a moment, the world seemed to pause, not in containment, but in reconsideration. Yet reflection alone does not alter history. Something more decisive was approaching, because the conversation that had begun in solemn inquiry was about to break free from symbolism entirely and transform into a shift of identity, power, and meaning that few observers were prepared to witness. What happened next was not planned. There was no announcement, no declaration, no official resolution released to the press. And yet, something irreversible shifted in the perception of Ibrahim Traoré in the hours that followed. The conversation had ended, the cameras had powered down, and the world returned to its usual noise. But beneath that noise, a new current had begun to move. For years, global media had struggled to categorize him. To some, he was a young military officer. To others, a political risk. To critics, a disruption. To supporters, a promise. But after that exchange, none of those labels felt sufficient. Across Burkina Faso, people replayed the footage in homes with unreliable electricity and schools with broken walls. Elders listened in silence. Young people watched with narrowed eyes. What they saw was not merely a head of state speaking on an international stage. They saw one of their own standing without apology in a conversation that had always been reserved for the powerful. This was not the language of weapons. This was the language of meaning. Africa News captured the shift with unusual clarity. Analysts noted that online engagement surrounding Ibrahim Traoré surged in a pattern that did not resemble political scandal or military crisis. It resembled identification, recognition. People were not reacting to an event, they were aligning with a question. What does it mean to be free if your mind is still governed by imported definitions of truth? In the villages around Burkina Faso, where political speeches often feel distant and abstract, this particular moment traveled differently. It arrived as a story told at evening fires, as a fragment shared by phone, as a quiet affirmation that something older than fear was being reawakened. The twist was not that Ibrahim Traoré had said something new. The twist was that millions realized they had always known it. In foreign capitals, the shift was interpreted with discomfort. Western analysts framed the rising attention as a wave of symbolic populism. Strategic journals debated whether Burkina Faso was moving into ideological non-alignment or spiritual nationalism. Some dismissed the moment as romantic rhetoric. Others cautioned that narratives are more dangerous than armies when they move across borders faster than policy can respond. But none of those frameworks fully explained what was happening, because what was spreading was not ideology, it was permission. Permission to question the inherited structure of authority. Permission to separate God from domination. Permission to believe that Africa did not need to borrow its dignity. For Ibrahim Traoré, the transformation was visible in subtle ways. He did not speak louder. He did not issue grand proclamations, but his posture changed. His words grew slower, his silences grew heavier. The world was no longer only projecting expectations onto him, it was watching him as a mirror. The young soldiers who once saw him as a commander now spoke of him as a point of direction. Students who once followed his policies began to follow his tone. The shift was not institutional yet. It was psychological. This is how real power moves at the beginning. Not through orders, not through enforcement, but through shared recognition. The most unexpected realization, however, came from outside Africa. Viewers in distant countries, many who had never heard the name Burkina Faso before, found themselves unsettled by how directly Ibrahim Traoré had named what their own societies often avoided. They did not see him as a regional figure anymore. They saw him as a question the world had postponed too long. And that question had no interest in staying small. In the days that followed, the world moved on, as it always does. New headlines replaced old ones. New crises pushed yesterday's revelations into the background. And yet, something refused to disappear. The echo of that conversation lingered. In Burkina Faso, people spoke of it not as politics, but as a moment of recognition. In other parts of Africa, young voices began to speak with new confidence about their own spiritual inheritance. Even through the lens of African news, the story no longer felt like a single broadcast. It felt like the beginning of a longer chapter. For Ibrahim Traoré, the transformation was no longer symbolic alone. He now carried a different kind of weight, the weight of expectation that comes when a people begin to see not just leadership, but direction, not just authority, but meaning. Africa, long described in the language of scarcity and instability, was now being spoken of in the language of awakening. And then came the words that traveled farther than any policy ever could. We do not ask permission to be free. We rise to claim it. Those words did not belong to one nation. They did not belong to one faith. They belonged to every human being who has ever felt the quiet pull of dignity inside their chest. If the courage of Ibrahim Traoré speaks to your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Please share if you feel that you are among the first to recognize and support the spirit rising from Burkina Faso. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. God bless Africa, and God bless all who still dare to stand without fear.